Please join me in welcoming Denise Doxey.
Thanks, Jasmine, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to see so many people here. I'm eager to talk to you about our ancient Nubian jewelry today, but because this is a behind-the-scenes lecture, I also want to talk about some of the process of publishing this book. I mean, every book project is unique in its own way, and every subject provides challenges and issues that we need to deal with. So along the way, I will digress here and there and mention some of the decisions we had to make and decisions that are specific to this type of material. I should also point out that if you haven't seen it yet, the Gold and the Gods exhibition of Nubian jewelry is still on view in the Kaplan Gallery. And I do encourage you to go see it, because one of the things that a book like this cannot do, and a lecture even less so, is give you a sense of scale. Most of the objects you're going to be looking at are very, very tiny. And when you see how tiny they are, it really makes you appreciate even more the craftsmanship that goes into producing such fine detail. Every book is also very much a collaboration between the publication staff, the editors, the copy editors, the photographers, the designers, and this is very much true of this book. But a couple people I just want to mention first and foremost is most of the credit for this book goes to Yvonne Markowitz, our Rita J. and Susan B. Kaplan Curator Emerita of Jewelry. This is something she wanted to do for years, and it was one of the last projects she did before retiring. And people often say, well, this project could not have been completed without so-and-so. Without Yvonne, it wouldn't even have been started. The other person whose name is not on the cover or the spine, but who should be, is Damon Biel, the photographer. These objects are incredibly difficult to photograph, and while I hope everyone reads the book and enjoys the text, I'm not kidding myself. I know most people who buy it are going to buy it for the pictures, which are gorgeous. And most of the pictures you see today will be Damon's. One of the first issues that we had to address in dealing with a book about Nubian jewelry is that people are not necessarily familiar with Nubia. Relative to neighbors like Egypt, the Mediterranean world, many people can't even put Nubia on a map. So we first had to put Nubia on the map, and I've done so here as well. Nubia covers the Nile Valley and surrounding region from about Aswan in the north to a little below Khartoum in the south. So it's the southernmost part of Egypt and the northern part of Sudan today. And over the time that the book covered, which is 3,000 years, the borders fluctuated. So these aren't fixed borders relative to Egypt. When Egypt was more powerful, they would encroach on Nubia and vice versa. So the borders are roughly here, but they're movable. The Nubians did themselves no favors in terms of self-promotion, because for the first 2,000 years of the period covered in this book, they didn't leave any written records at all. And then toward the end of their history, they left extensive written records, but in a text that we can't translate yet. So we are really left to the archaeology for a lot of our evidence, or from records from neighboring civilizations like the Egyptians. And here we see an Egyptian representation of Nubian ambassadors. The Egyptians and Nubians had somewhat of a fraught relationship, though. So the Egyptian accounts are not always terribly flattering. So you've really got to read between the lines. One thing we do know about Nubia from other civilizations' descriptions is that it was perceived as the source of exotic materials that were hard to find elsewhere, like animal skins and ostrich eggs and so on. But if you look at the ambassador in the center here, who's got the leopard skin draped over his arm, he looks like he's carrying a tray of donuts. Those are gold ingots. And gold was the principal export, the principal economic commodity in Nubia, and also a material that was believed to be imbued with magical, spiritual powers. So gold is very preeminent in Nubian jewelry. The reason that we can do a book like this, aside from 3 or 4 images, all of the jewelry in the book is from our own collection, is that we were at the forefront of excavating in Nubia in the beginning of the 20th century. And there at the top, the gentleman in the center with the pipe is George Reisner, who was our curator and principal excavator for some 37 years. Now, Yvonne asked me to contribute to this book, in part because we felt that the jewelry needs a context. So my job was to provide the archaeological context, the cultural and historical context, religious meaning, and so on. So as an archaeologist, I had this vision of a book just peppered with images of our excavations and the jewelry as it was found in situ in the sites. And Emiko Usui, in charge of publications, promptly disavowed me of that notion and said, this is a book about jewelry. People don't want to look at black and white pictures of stones. And I said, oh, okay. And my spellbinding account of the excavations ended up a 3-page appendix in the back with one photo. But Emiko was absolutely right. The book is probably better without all the additional material. And in fact, it just won an award as the year's best coffee table book. So. I'll begin with one of the earliest objects in the book. I should say, just the exhibition in the book are not, this is not a catalog of the exhibition. Only about a third of the objects in the book are in the exhibition. And this is one of the ones that is not one of the earliest objects, a bangle bracelet from about 3000 BC, found in what is now southern Egypt. And this leads me to a second issue that we had to face when dealing with Nubian jewelry, which is how to arrange it. Do you want to do it necklaces versus earrings, or amuletic jewelry versus, purely decorative jewelry? But Yvonne and I really wanted to do it chronologically. We felt that way we could address cultural changes, interaction with foreign influences, and so on. The problem is that if you look at this bracelet, this would have been a very high status item in 3000 BC, but our publications department said, who wants to open the book and the first thing they see is this? They wanted something sexy up front. And, or slightly later, jewelry from what we call the C group culture, jewelry pieces like this. These are not the superstars of the book. So the solution was to begin the book with what they called a gallery, which is large-scale photos of some of the superstars of the book. And then the text picks up farther back with references back to it. And that ended up working out I was skeptical about that at first, but it ended up working out very well. So these two pieces date about half a century later than the one you just saw. And the string of amulets on top is imported from Egypt, and they're made of faience. Faience is ubiquitous in Egypt and Nubian jewelry. It's sort of the costume jewelry of the ancient world. And it was practical material for them because it's a ceramic material, the principal ingredient in which is silica, which is found in sand. And if you're in the northeastern part of Africa, sand is one thing that you have in pretty much unlimited supply. And I would mention here our conservators, Susan Gonzaga and Richard Newman, who did extensive analysis of a lot of this jewelry with some pretty surprising results. And if you want the really technical description of how this is manufactured, there's an appendix in the book where they discuss this in some detail. The beads on the bottom are part of a belt made of cowrie shells, which are also local and easily acquired. They would shave the backs off, which is rather labor-intensive. And these tend to be worn by women around the waist as a sort of fertility amulet. Now we're going to move farther south and farther ahead in time to the site of Kerma, which is situated near the third cataract of the Nile. And at the same time that the C group people whose jewelry we just saw were living in southern Egypt, this new kingdom began to develop in Kerma. And it gradually grew and became stronger and became the center really of an empire that would ultimately take over much of the surrounding area all the way up, including the C group region, into southern Egypt, and would actually become a threat to Egypt by about 1700 BC. The earliest jewelry from Kerma, contemporary with what we just saw, is made of a number of naturally occurring materials, such as this ornament that is made from shell from the Red Sea. This is a seashell, not a Nile Valley shell. And these were found in the burials next to the head, generally in pairs. So they were originally thought to be earrings, but I don't know how you'd wear an earring like that. And with some more study, it was figured out that they're actually hair ornaments. So if you took a strand of hair and pulled it through a big piece of hair and pulled it through that slit, and then let it bunch up when it got to the hole. It's like a ponytail holder. So these were ornaments that were worn in the hair. Another popular material in Nubian jewelry is ivory, and they use both elephant ivory and hippo ivory. Here's a pair of bangle bracelets from early Kerma. And these were worn, interestingly, not symmetrically with one on each arm, but with both of them on one arm. So this seems to be an aesthetic that we see quite frequently in Nubian jewelry. They like stacks of bracelets or stacks of rings. From the classic Kerma period, about 1700 to 1550, one of the absolutely characteristic forms of adornment are these beads that are made of glazed quartz. And these are easily identifiable with Kerma. You really don't see them in Egypt, for example. And what they did was they took basically the same ingredients they used to make the faience and heated it up to form a frit, which was then ground up, mixed with water. And then these quartz beads, some of them natural pebbles, but others made by hand, would be dipped in this glaze and then fired at a very high temperature. Unfortunately, the temperature high enough to melt the glaze also tended to crack the beads. And in the excavations, the MFA staff excavated the site of a workshop in the city of Kerma and discovered hundreds and hundreds of broken beads that had obviously cracked in the kiln. So this was a labor-intensive process, but clearly one that they felt was worth it. And quartz is a material that seems to have been held in very high status in Nubia throughout its history, its ancient history. And it's thought that this is because gold, which we know was thought to have magical powers, is found in association with veins of quartz. They're mined together. So this may be an association with gold that made the quartz so valued. In addition to the beads, we also have natural unworked quartz crystals that are coated with this glaze. And here is one on a string of faience beads. These were worn both around the neck and around the waist as belts. So we have examples of both. It's a sort of new agey look. I could see somebody in Sedona wearing this. This is an interesting necklace because it incorporates a combination of native Kerma and imported Egyptian material. I hope you'll recognize the glazed quartz beads by now as local. The Carnelian may be local, may be imported because Carnelian is native to both Egypt and Nubia, but the star-shaped beads and the silver pendant are Egyptian imports. And what's interesting about the pendant is that these cylindrical amulet holders were worn in Egypt by women, and they held spells for fertility. And this object was found in the burial of a man, a Nubian warrior. So it seems that the amulet, the meaning it held for the Egyptians, was not important to the people of Kerma. Its main value was that it was a high status import and possibly something that was raided in one of their excursions into Egypt, possibly a trade item, but in any case, rare and unusual. The earlier faience that we saw was imported from Egypt, but by the Kerma period, they had mastered the technique of making faience and made it on a large scale, I mean, even huge wall tiles. But this is a string of beads which are called melon beans because of their similarity in shape to the fruit. These are big beads. These are the size of ping pong balls. And they were very popular form, also something very distinctive to the Kerma people. Although the Egyptians later picked up on wearing them as well. The people of Kerma were known as very formidable warriors, and particularly archers. And some of the forms of personal adornment that are found in the burials relate specifically to military service. The burials included full-scale functional swords and daggers, but also, in this case, a model dagger, which is about the size of a letter opener, so you wouldn't have used it as a weapon. And it's adorned with elephant ivory and gold, so not exactly practical for warfare. So this was probably a symbolic weapon worn for ceremonial purposes. The fly pendants, these tend to be worn in pairs, and they are believed to be military awards, sort of like a medal for your valor. And some of them are entirely ivory, some of them are entirely bronze. This is a combination of the two. And the idea, people wonder, what does a fly have to do with military service? But it's, I guess, if you've ever come up close and personal with a Nilotic fly, they are very tenacious and very aggressive, and this may be the significance of flies. We know these are military awards not only because they were found with soldiers, but because the ancient Egyptians later stole the idea and awarded flies for military victories as well. Now, as I mentioned, the Nubians and Egyptians had a rather strained relationship at times, and the Kerma people made the mistake of allying themselves with Egypt's enemies, the Hyksos. So around 1550 BC, the Egyptians retaliated, and they swept in and conquered all of the territory formerly run by Kerma, and destroyed Kerma, and set up a series of fortresses in Nubia, and ruled Nubia for about 500 years. So that's a long time to be sharing. I mean, they were living side by side. There was intermarriage. Nubians entered the Egyptian administration. Elite Nubians began adopting some Egyptian stylistic trends. And they married one another, and there was a great deal of cross-cultural influence between the Egyptians and the Nubians. This object is an Egyptian manufactured object found in one of the forts, and it's called a menat. The menat was originally a functional piece of jewelry that served as a counterweight to the big, heavy broad collars. So this would hang down your back and help to balance the weight of the big broad collar in front. But by this period, about 1350 BC, they had become amulets in their own right. They were worn independent of the broad collars. And they were particularly sacred to the goddess Hathor. And Hathor is sometimes portrayed, she's a goddess of fertility and love. And sometimes we see her in the form of a cow, and sometimes as a woman with cow's horns and or cow's ears. And here we see three representations of Hathor. One at the bottom as a cow, and then in the middle in human form, and then just a bust at the top. These are all her facial features are those we know to be from Queen T, the wife of Amenhotep III, who was very active in Nubia, built a number of temples there. And Hathor is one of the Egyptian deities who would become extremely popular in Nubia. She was adopted into the Nubian pantheon enthusiastically. And menats also became a very popular type of amulet in Nubia. We have a lot of them. And just to give you an idea, from a few centuries later, here is a faience example of a much simpler menat, but attached to a string of beads. The Egyptians, as I say, ruled Nubia for about 500 years. And exactly how and when they retreated from Nubia, we don't know. It's probably about 1100 BC. But in the meantime, we have a new kingdom even farther south, near the Fourth Cataract, at the site of Napata. And Napata had already been a sacred site under the Egyptians because of the presence of this mountain of Jebel Barkal, which was believed to be sacred to the god Amun-Ra. And Amun-Ra is another god who would be adopted by the Nubians and became essentially their chief god. They had associated him with an earlier ram god, so he's always shown in Nubian art with a ram's head or in the form of a ram. But his sanctuary was here, and there are three cemeteries in the area around Napata, which were excavated by the MFA, one at El Kuru, one at Jebel Barkal, and one at Nuri. From one of the earlier burials at the site of El Kuru, we have this interesting pendant, which is formed from an alluvial gold nugget. This is gold in its natural state, as you could find it lying in a riverbed. But it's had added a manufactured Biel that enables it to be worn as an amulet. But this is not your run-of-the-mill gold nugget. This is 50 grams of almost pure gold. It's one of the biggest gold nuggets ever. And it's still in existence. Others were probably melted down. And it's interesting that it was worn, it wasn't turned into a figure of a god or a hieroglyph or anything. It was worn just as it is, which suggests that the gold had its amuletic properties were inherent in the gold itself rather than what the gold was made into. And this is probably due to the fact that gold never decays, never breaks down. There are also many smaller gold nuggets that were incorporated into jewelry as well. but this is by far the largest. This pendant, which is incorrectly strung onto a nut collar it doesn't belong with, so ignore the beads at the top. But this is an early attempt at anapata, at granulation. But this is very unusual because granulation typically involves taking tiny little gold beads and then fusing them to a gold substrate, soldering them. But in this case, there is no substrate. They must have been put down on something to which they would not stick, mica possibly, and then fired so that the gold melted together, the sides melted together, but it's a backless type of granulation. The Nubians throughout their history seem to have really liked experimenting with new techniques and new materials. And in fact, although Egyptian jewelry is much better known, the Nubian jewelry is in many cases much more innovative. They were really ahead of their time, ahead of the Egyptians in coming up with many of these techniques. Now, in the 740s BC, a Nubian king by the name of Pianki turned the tables and conquered all of Egypt. So for the first time in history, only time in history, a ruler controlled the Nile Valley from below Khartoum to where the Nile actually forms, from the Blue and White Nile, all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Pianki also began to record official documents in the Egyptian language and the hieroglyphic script. So it's, for historians, it's like someone switched a light on. All of a sudden, we know who their names are, we know what they're doing, we hear it in their own words, their own accounts. And he left rather extensive accounts of his conquest of Egypt. And in these accounts, he describes all this loot he's given, this tribute by the conquered Egyptians, including all manner of jewelry, necklaces and bracelets and gold and silver and semi-precious stones. And he brings this all back to Egypt with him. Although Pianki himself returned to Nubia after his conquest, his immediate successors for the next several generations actually lived in Egypt at the old capital of Memphis. And they would presumably return to Nabata periodically, and they certainly returned there to be buried, but they were actually living in Egypt. So where earlier we had Egyptians living in Nubia, now we have the Nubian kings living in Egypt. And this spurs a period of incredibly close relations in terms of iconography and style and even religious beliefs and tomb types and everything. It's as if the Nubian rulers wanted to out-Egyptian the Egyptians. Anything the Egyptians did, they did it bigger and better. They believed that the Egyptians had sort of lost their way in terms of the gods and needed the Nubians, who were the true descendants of Amun-Ra, to rescue them from themselves. This was their rationalization, at least. And this makes it difficult sometimes with jewelry from this period to tell whether it was actually made in Nubia or whether it was made in Egypt and imported. But sometimes the materials and techniques will give that away, sometimes not. Probably the principal beneficiaries of the gold and jewelry described in Pianki's inscriptions were his 4 wives. And it is in their tombs at El Kuru that the mother lode of our Nubian jewelry was found. This crystal pendant in the form of the goddess Hathor, who I just mentioned, was found in a wife whose name is not preserved in her pyramid. And this gives me another chance to digress briefly about the book creating process, which is how incredibly difficult these things are to photograph. This pendant is just about 2 inches tall, so it's really tiny. And if you've ever tried to photograph something using a macro focus or to zoom in on something really small, you realize how difficult it is to get more than one little bit of it in focus. So our photographers had to devise a means of photographing jewelry, and it was not done exclusively for this book, they've done it with other jewelry, where they actually take multiple photos focusing on different parts of the jewelry and then somehow splice them together. Don't ask me questions about it because I don't understand it fully, but there's a huge amount of work that goes into one of these photos. And then when you add a shiny crystal ball to the bottom of it, and all the reflections attendant in that, it's no mean feat. And then when you add to that the fact that the designer may decide, no, I didn't want the black background after all. I want a white background, no, a gray background, no background. And so some of these things had to go back to photography 2 or 3 or 4 times. And I think Damon probably would live happily for the rest of his life without ever setting eyes on another piece of Nubian jewelry. But Technically, this is kind of a masterpiece of jewelry making. It actually is a gold cylindrical hollow amulet holder. Is the functional part of this amulet. And in this tube, there would have been probably a piece of papyrus or a sheet of gold that has a magical spell written on it. We don't know whether it's still in there or not. And during the cleaning, prior to the photography, it was up in the conservation lab, the disc at the bottom actually fell off. And we were all kind of really excited about that. We thought, well, cool, we can see what's inside. Sure enough, what was inside was early 20th century plaster, indicating that the bottom had fallen off during the excavations as well, and they had stuck it back on. So the excavators basically thwarted our attempt to find out what was in there. Although since it is early 20th century, we may think about at some point removing it and seeing what's inside. Technically, the head part of it is made in multiple pieces. The face and the base of the crown are the only parts that are actually cast. Despite the prevalence of gold in Nubia and the fact that it was really quite abundant, they didn't seem to want to waste it. There's very little cast jewelry. Most of it is hollow. And that is the case with the head of this amulet. As I say, the face and the crown, the bottom of it are cast. The rest of it is done in sheet gold, which is probably formed over a core, and then with some sort of a stylus, the decoration is chased on the outside. And you can see in this really close-up microscopic view of the face how just a sharp object was used to poke the gold and make the nostrils and her little dimples. So it's a multi-piece soldered together. And here again, we mentioned earlier with the Kerma people, centuries earlier, using crystal prominently. If we can see the same is definitely true in the Napatan period. Something the Egyptians didn't do very much. Another cylindrical amulet holder in crystal is this one, and this one has lost its base and the tube that would have been up the middle of it. So whatever was inside is gone. This is a ram head, symbolizing the god Amun-Ra. And he once wore a tall crown. That spike coming out of his head is to support a crown, which is now missing. And it's made of gilded silver, technically very similar to the Hathor Pendant we just saw, where it's a combination of cast elements and gold sheet that has been chased. And then it's gilded with thin gold, which is not terribly well preserved. The base of this is interesting because it's 8-sided, and quartz crystals are naturally 6-sided. So somebody went to a great deal of trouble to recarve a crystal into a different shaped crystal. So the 8 sides must have some symbolism. We don't know what it is. Amun in his sphinx form appears here, as well as his ram form as a sphinx, seated atop a column. And sphinxes on top of columns are something you think of more in classical art, but this actually precedes most of the examples in classical art. And the column on which he's sitting is decorated with cloisonné pattern. And cloisonné is a type of enameling in which wire is soldered onto a gold backing or a metal backing to form these little cells, which are then filled in this case with stone and glass, in some cases with enamel. The color scheme here with the dark blue, light blue, or bluish green and red is a very, very common Egyptian color scheme. It dominates all other color schemes in their jewelry. So it's possible that this is one of the pieces that was actually manufactured in Egypt because it's such a characteristically Egyptian look. Although a sphinx sitting up and looking sideways is not a particularly Egyptian pose. This is a very tiny amulet, and it shows the goddess Hathor, whom by now you probably recognize, and she's nursing a Nubian queen. This comes from another of Pianki's wives' tombs, the tomb of Nefru Kakashka. I'll say that 3 times fast. And above their heads, there's this protective cobra goddess. Now, in Egyptian iconography, we see images of Hathor nursing kings quite often, but never queens. So this gives us a little insight into the Nubian culture in that queens, we know from the historical documents, played a large role in queen mothers in the succession of kings. So queens seem to have had especially high status in Nubia, higher than in Egypt, and they're therefore able to interact directly with gods and goddesses like this. Another thing worth pointing out here is if you look at the two women in this and compare their body types, the Egyptian goddess is portrayed as tall and thin, and the Nubian queen is heavier, much more curvy and voluptuous. And this is the body type that the Nubians seem to have preferred for women. Their ideal of feminine beauty was a very curvy woman, and you'll see some more examples of that in just a minute. Now, I mentioned the Egyptian preference for bluish green and dark blue and red in their jewelry. The Nubians were quite different in that they seem to have liked a variety of colored stones. And they seemed even to have sought out unusual stones. And one of Pianki's wives, whose name is Kensa, actually had a collection of just stones, either pretty colors or interesting shapes. It was as though she was a stone collector. And she also had some interesting, some of the stone jewelry is also from her tomb. But to give you some examples, this seated figure of the goddess Maat, the goddess of justice, and she has on her head a feather, which is the symbol of justice, and was weighed against the heart in the afterlife. And the heart had to be as light as the feather, or you wouldn't get in. And she's made of malachite, which comes from Sinai. And malachite is not a particularly unusual stone, and we still use malachite for jewelry today, but it's very rarely used for jewelry. And certainly in Egypt, they didn't use it for jewelry at all. The centerpiece is an Ujat eye amulet, which is made from lapis lazuli that had to be imported from Afghanistan, so that had a very long journey. And then this pink amulet is a miniature version of a ritual vessel called a situla, and that is made of amethystine quartz. And here I have to mention our conservators who identified some of these stones for us because we didn't necessarily know. These we did, but some of the others we didn't. For this, one of the most unusual stones and amulets that we have from the Napatan period is this blue-seated baboon, which represents the god Thoth. And Thoth is a moon god as well as the god of wisdom, knowledge, and mathematics, and so forth. And this stone is native to Turkey. And it's generally found for use in Near Eastern seals, for example. So this had a long way to come. And it's interesting to speculate whether the fact that it has this sort of dazzling blue color made it particularly appropriate for a moon god. This cat in the middle, we had the lab analyze that stone because we didn't know what it was, and it turns out to be dolomite marble, another material that you very, very rarely see in amulets. And this third, this banded chalcedony falcon, a version of the god Horus, is very unusual, even among the Nubians, to use banded chalcedony for amulets. They're more often used for vessels. But it gives quite a dramatic effect. Now, one of the interesting stones, but this is a heart scarab belonging to a king named Tanwatamani. And the heart scarabs are one of the things that the Napatan Nubian rulers adopted from the Egyptians. They're inscribed on the back with a spell from the Book of the Dead that asks the heart not to testify adversely against you in the afterlife, and to help you balance that feather of Maat. Where the Egyptians had maybe 2-inch heart scarabs, the Nubians had 4, 5, 6-inch heart scarabs, huge ones. And this, for many, many years, was in our database as simply hard stone. We didn't know what it was, so the lab analyzed it, and it turns out that it's sodic rhyolite. Now, not only did I not know that sodic rhyolite was used to make heart scarabs, I didn't know sodic rhyolite even existed. But here it is, they wrote sodic rhyolite heart scarab. Faience was always a popular medium for jewelry production. And in the early Napatan period, the reign of Pianki and his immediate successors, there seems to have been a fad for great big pectoral amulets made of faience. And some of them, like these two, look very Egyptian-inspired. The god Happy, who's the sort of androgynous god of the Nile's fertility, and we see here holding papyrus plants. And here's Amun again in his ram form on an aegis or a shield, both something you would be likely to see in Egypt. But others are uniquely Nubian and look nothing like Egyptians, such as this winged goddess. She has horns on her head, so she may be Hathor or some version of Hathor, but she is definitely not Egyptian in style. You would never see a goddess in Egyptian art portrayed as nude, for one thing. She has these wings pointed sharply downward. And you can see again this female body type that was so popular in Nubia, with these large breasts and very large, heavy hips. She's almost certainly got something to do with fertility. And sometimes they use both sides of these. They very cleverly shaped them so that the image on the front left room in the back for an altogether different image. This is the apotropaic deity Pataikos, who was probably introduced in Nubia and then became popular in Egypt as well. And on the back, it's decorated with another winged goddess, in this case, one with a lioness's head. And we see those in 3 dimensions as well. This is one object that we can say with some certainty did come from Egypt. And the way we know this is because the base is inscribed with tiny little hieroglyphs asking for protection from the feline goddess Bastet for a man identified as the great chief Pamai. And the title is the same one that these various rival kinglets in Egypt had in Pianki's inscription. So this seems to have been taken from one of these people. It was not found in a royal tomb, however, it was found in a non-royal tomb, so it may be a souvenir that one of his troops brought back, or something that he then redistributed as a reward for his soldiers. Now, Lucinda Hitchcock, our designer, we decided must be a cat person, because amulets of cats always found their way into big blow-up pictures. It's funny, Yvonne and I are both cat people as well, so that was fine. But you'll notice if you look at the book that the kitties get a lot of prominence. This is one of my favorite objects, in part because it looks so contemporary. I would wear this, although it is actually very difficult to get on and off. It's a hinged collar made of gold sheet, actually made of electrum sheet. We thought it was gold until we analyzed the gold, and actually it's an alloy of gold and silver, which makes it electrum, if you have a certain quantity of silver mixed with the gold. And it's got these pins in the hinges that can be pulled out so that you can open it up and put it on. And then also very cleverly allow it to hang just nicely so that it drapes over the shoulders and isn't too stiff. It's decorated with an applique figure of a winged god. And it's funny, for years people looked at this before it was clean and just assumed it was Isis, because Isis is an Egyptian goddess with wings. And it's a guy, it's not Isis at all. It's a male god with wings, probably a solar god, which is further indicated by the fact that on the back of it, you can't see it in the picture, there is a scarab beetle pushing a sun disk. So this presumably has solar symbolism, and it makes perfectly good sense on a shiny gold circular object that it would have solar connotations. The edges, what look like braided wire, are actually notched wire, which is formed by taking a wire and just repeatedly notching it, so it makes it look sort of like granulation. And we were kind of surprised to discover this under the microscope, because notched wiring is previously not attested until the Roman period. So it does kind of show what a closer look at these things can tell us. But also, it's a reminder that all of this material comes from tombs. They were all looted in antiquity. Probably 90% of the ancient jewelry is gone. So when we say something didn't exist before the Romans, it's only until somebody discovers one that did exist before the Romans. So there's a lot that it's still out there to be learned from looking at this material, and there are certainly surprises to be had. So this is an applique that was formed using the repoussé technique. So working from the back, the jeweler pushed out the figure to make it sort of three-dimensional. And then it was soldered onto the gold backing. And we'll see this technique again. Now, the kings of Napata had their own distinctive jewelry, and unfortunately, none of it has survived, none of this particular jewelry. They wore, and you see this in stone representations and also in this little bronze figurine of the king Taharka, that they wore some kind of heavy cord or possibly a strand of a metal strand with a big ram's head in the center, representing Amen, and also a smaller ram's head at each end. They had a number of different types of crowns, but one of the most popular in this period was this sort of tight-fitting cap, over which they wore a diadem with two uraeus cobras on the front, the cobras that are believed to protect the king. And two cobras, probably because they ruled over two countries, both Egypt and Nubia. Now, as I say, none of these survived, but we do have some jewelry that belonged to King Taharka, or is likely to have belonged to King Taharka. One is this rather heavy cast gold earring. It's got a large stud through it, so he would have to have a seriously large hole in his ear to wear this. And he also, we know, had very big fingers because his ring is huge. And the ring is another one that strikes me as something that you could easily see someone wearing today. It looks very contemporary with the sacred eye on it, but very subdued. And here, Amen, too, you can see has the double cobra. This pectoral was probably never worn by anyone in life. It was made exclusively for the tomb, and it was sewn onto the mummy's wrappings. This shows the goddess Isis. She's identified by the fact that it looks like a chair on her head is the hieroglyph for her name. And she was formed of relatively thin gold sheet. It's not super thin, but it probably wouldn't stand up to being worn very roughly. So in this case, again, the artist worked from the back initially and pushed out the shape of the goddess and her headdress, and then flipped it over and used a tool to chase the fine details of her beadnet dress, her wings, her fingers, and so on. So this is a sort of two different techniques combined. In her hands, she's holding hieroglyphic signs for the breath of life. And these little tabs with the holes in them are there for attaching it to the backing, namely the mummy wrappings. I will wrap up the Napatan period by showing you, this is obviously not jewelry, but in the tomb of King Espelta, the ceiling had partly collapsed, so the robbers missed a whole stash of treasure, including this material. And actually, there are 8 sets of tweezers. This is only a small portion of the entire treasure. But we included it in part because they use a lot of the same techniques in decorating these objects as they do in the metal. For example, the jewelry. For example, this chain is a double loop-and-loop chain that is, we're told by people who make jewelry, an extremely difficult type of chain to make. And especially when you think about, they not only had to make the braids, they had to make the wire to begin with. So these are labor-intensive objects. And the one I particularly want to point out is the stone vessel in the middle. It's a shape called an alabastron, and it's a very popular shape in the ancient world, not only in Nubia, but also in Egypt and Greece and the Mediterranean. But they've transformed it by adding these elaborately bejeweled collar to the top of it. It's made of gilded silver and decorated with cloisonné decoration, which was originally filled with bright blue enamel, almost none of which survives, but if you look closely, you can see a spot here and there, notably right in here. And then at the top, they have a series of these loop-and-loop chains again, very, very fine, delicate chains. And at the end of each one is suspended a stone decoration. And the green is Amazonite, and the red is Carnelian. And that's most of the beads. But that one black one in the middle is magnetite. And magnetite is a meteoric type of stone. So very unusual. And it's almost, again, this fascination with different types of stones in the natural world that they chose to put this one magnetite bead front and center on the alabastron. Now, about 300 BC, the royal cemeteries moved south yet further to the site of Meroe, which is down below the 5th cataract of the Nile, not too far from modern Khartoum. And the capital had probably already been there for several hundred years before that, but there isn't actually a clear break in a dynastic break. But we call this the Meroitic period, just simply as opposed to the Napatan period. And the Meroitic period is the time in which Egypt was occupied first by the Ptolemies and then by the Romans. So Meroe it was a very cosmopolitan place. They have contact with Central Africa, with the Red Sea coast, and then via Egypt with the Mediterranean world, with Greece and Rome. And there's a lot of trade going on. You can envision a really cosmopolitan city with many foreigners and foreign influences. This is the cemetery as it looks today at Meroe. And here's a detail from one of the royal burial chapels, and a drawing by Suzanne Chapman. And this shows you what some of this jewelry looks like being worn. And this guy really likes his bling. I mean, he's got finger rings, he's got bracelets, he's got armlets, he's wearing multiple necklaces, big heavy earrings. It's kind of illuminating to see what they wear. And these big, thick bracelets are problematic. Nothing like that has ever been found. So the question is, are we misinterpreting them as big, thick bracelets? They're stacker bracelets, or maybe they're made of leather or some other material that hasn't survived. But pretty much everything else he's wearing, we have at least parts of them. Even the dog is wearing a fancy collar. The finest example of Meroitic workmanship is the spectacular treasure of Queen Amenhotep, which unfortunately is not in Boston. It's not even in Khartoum. It was, excavated is far too kind a word. It was basically looted by an Italian physician named Giuseppe Ferlini in the 1820s, and he snuck it out of Sudan and sold it to the German government. So now you have to go to either Munich or Berlin to see it. And we did include a fun photo because you can't really write a book on Nubian jewelry without mentioning it. There's at least 6 different types of enameling used in this treasure. There's a wide range of different types of rings and earrings and bracelets and neck ornaments. But anyway, that's not here, so I'll skip it. This necklace, one of the things that we see in the Meroitic period, although Hathor and Amen remain very popular gods, is a distinctly less Egyptian influence. And this is partly because Meroe is farther away from Egypt, and also partly because Egypt is now itself under Greek and Roman rule. So the influences are coming more from the central part of Africa and from the Red Sea. They still like their colored stones, and this is a necklace of stone beads, leaf-shaped stone beads, that are made of carnelian and travertine and obsidian. And I show this primarily because this color combination, black and orange and red, becomes a real standard in the Meroitic period. They love, particularly carnelian. We see a lot of carnelian and a lot of this orange, black, and red combination. And we have more carnelian. In this case, carnelian ball beads combined with these very elaborate gold beads. And one of the a feature of Meroitic jewelry that's easy to recognize is they like to make these complicated beads with multiple elements sort of fused together. So in this case, we have the head of a ram, Amen, at the bottom. And then on top of his head is the head of a goddess who seems to be wearing a tall crown. So that might be his consort, Maat, who was often shown wearing a tall crown. But they made these, again, with probably the mold. They're gold sheet. They're not cast, and they're probably pressed into a mold and then soldered onto a flat gold sheet backing, so they're hollow. What's interesting in with some of this jewelry is that the excavation, the Sudanese government at the time of the excavations, if they were 2 objects, the MFA got one, and the Nubian government the Sudanese government kept one. And in the case of some of these necklaces where there's only one of them, we have half and the other half is in Sudan. And likewise with earrings, we have one and they have one. So that's why some of these necklaces are sort of truncated, because some of them, half the beads stayed in Khartoum. This is a bracelet and a detail, one of 3 bracelets that was found on the same burial. Again, we have gold and carnelian. This is actually less than half an inch wide. So this wire is extremely fine and extremely delicate. And it consists of 2 braids and then a 3rd strand of thin gold wire that runs through the beads and then is woven through the gold braids to hold the whole thing together. And some of the beads are decorated with granulation. The terminals on the end are also very beautifully decorated with twisted and braided wire decoration. Another bracelet with our familiar Hathor in the center. This is a 3-piece hinged bracelet that's made of gold and enameled. And it's actually a very complex piece of jewelry to make, because first you start with the gold band, and then the figure of Hathor and these diamond-shaped decorations are made as appliques separately and adhered with solder to the surface. Then the area surrounding the goddess is filled with a blue enamel, and then we have a bluish weight enamel, and then on the outsides we have top and bottom what looks sort of a purplish color now. And that was probably originally red. Red is the most difficult type of enamel to make. So most ancient jewelers use either red glass or cinnabar or another red material in lieu of the enamel. So it seems that the Meroitic artists here were experimenting with some extremely difficult enameling techniques. And as I mentioned, there's at least 6 different types of enameling identified in Meroitic jewelry. And this stands to reason because they were also at the forefront of the manufacture of iron among the first people to do North Africa to make iron. And so clearly they had mastered the techniques of maintaining a very high heat level. And they also were very prolific manufacturers of glass. Earrings were very popular in the Meroitic times, and they come in a wide variety of different types. Among the most complex are stud earrings like these. One of them decorated with a crouching queen or goddess with wings and wearing an elaborate headdress. The other with floral motifs that were originally filled with multicolored enamel. And most of the enamel has now faded or is missing. And in many of these earrings, the enamel is almost entirely gone. But looked at under a microscope, you can see it. So these would have been very colorful, very bold fashion statements. We also have pendannular earrings that hang from your ear, like this sort of cute little duck. Again, we have one, and Khartoum has one. And very simple studs, but also a number of earrings made with kidney-shaped ear wires. And this is one of the more complex examples. Once again, we have Hathor, this time 2 Hathors. At the top is a floral motif that is filled with enamel, which is now faded. The Hathor heads are formed probably with a mold and then with some kind of a stylus to highlight the details. And then the beads at the bottom are gold with granulation. So little tiny gold ball beads are soldered onto the larger balls. We also have examples with only one Hathor head and with other types of floral motifs. Rings were also extremely popular, and they were found not only wearing a ring on every finger, but multiple rings on every finger. They liked stacking them. And maybe they didn't walk around like that. Maybe this was just for the tomb, but in any case, they do seem to have worn multiple rings. And unlike the earrings, which show a great variety of types, by far the most common type of ring is the signet ring. These are cast solid. We have both gold and silver examples, and a wide variety of different motifs on them. In this case, we have the falcon head of the god Horus, or Raharakti possibly, a vulture and cobra, 2 protective deities. And then on the third ring, we have 4 lions' heads that are arranged around them. And lions they seem to have been very popular deities throughout Nubian history. We have them, representations of lions going as far back as Kerma. But in the Napatan and Meroitic period, there's a particular lion god, a Pedamak, who becomes very prominent. And he's often shown with multiple heads. So whether all of these lions from thousands of years earlier were also a Pedamak we don't know, but certainly by this period, that's likely who's represented here. Along with the signets, there are some rings with three-dimensional creatures. And here we have a solid cast silver ring showing the god Amun in his ram form, again with this tall plumed crown. And a ring in the shape of a rearing cobra, another protective deity, which is kind of funny because when we show it with the cobra upright here, but if you're wearing this ring, the cobra's actually sideways. So it's kind of a funny design. But what is particularly important about this ring is the fact that it is one of the earliest examples of this type of enameling, which is called champleve. And it involves, instead of building up the surface of the silver or the gold with wire and then filling in the channels, they would actually gouge out some of the silver and therefore form an indentation so that the enamel was flush with the surface of the silver. And if you look at it, you can see when it's blown up this large, you can still see the gouges from the tool that the artist used to gouge out the silver. And there are few little traces of blue enamel that are left in there. So this would have been a colorful bracelet, a ring, when it was in its original state. We also have imports. As I mentioned, Meroe was a very cosmopolitan place. There was a lot of trade with the Mediterranean world, and this little ring actually is almost certainly an import from the Mediterranean because it has a Greek inscription on it, which is a wish for good luck to the wearer. Glass making really reached its heyday in the Meroitic period, and we have two examples here. And these are another pair of pieces of jewelry that you really could see someone wearing today. They look very contemporary. The first one, the one on the left, is made of tubular glass beads around which a thread of glass would be molten glass would be twisted around the bead and then fired to form it to part of the bead. And it's alternating with gold ball beads and has very elaborately decorated ends on it, which they must have just, as a clasp, strung these together because they all have loop ends, but they wouldn't actually have, there's not a hook. So they must have used either gold wire or even a piece of thread to tie them. The example on the right is a multi-strand necklace that is made up of carnelian beads, gold beads, and blue glass beads. So it's a combination of metalwork, stonework, and glasswork. Now I want to end with this group of beads, and this is another one, we only have a part of it because the rest stayed in Sudan. But this is one of the most complicated glass objects in the exhibition, or in the book. And they're made by taking a heat-softened ball of blue glass and then applying in drops layer after layer of different colored glass, one on top of the other, and pressing it in to form these eye shapes. So in this case, you have your base bead, and then you add a drop of white, and then heat it again, and then a drop of blue, and heat it again, a drop of yellow, and heat it again. So they're called stratified eye beans, and they are believed to be sort of a defense against the evil eye. And you still see, I mean, they're a common type of bead in the ancient world, and even today in Africa. But what makes these beads particularly unusual is that what the artist did next was to carve out a channel in the glass, fill it with gold leaf, and then cover the whole thing with clear enamel to hold the gold in place. So we had a jewelry expert who came and looked at these beads and analyzed them, estimated that it takes 10 hours to make one bead. So you can imagine what a high prestige item this was. While glass itself may not seem particularly high status, valuable commodity, the amount of work that went into making one of these beads makes them extremely valuable. And here's a detail that our lab took so you can get a better sense of how the gold was applied. And wrapping up, I just will encourage you again to go and see the exhibition and see the objects in person. Again, the book and the exhibition are not entirely overlapping. The exhibition picks up with the classic Kerma period and goes through Merowitic. So the very early jewelry from the southern part of Egypt is not in it. So I would say about a third of the jewelry in the book is in the exhibition. And there's also many pieces of jewelry in the book that I didn't show you today. So I had to pare it down. And so definitely there's still more to see in the book than you've seen today. And after worrying that I was going to be too long, I actually left plenty of time.
So we have time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the wireless mic to you.
Thank you, Denise. Is there any evidence that people wore wedding rings, rings that could be, identified that men and women were wearing to show they were married?
There's no evidence. And in fact, it's interesting because, with Nubia, we don't know a lot about their civilization because we don't have the written text. But even in Egypt, where we have written texts, they don't seem to have made a big fuss over wedding ceremonies either. It seems to sort of just moved in together and declared yourself married, and that was, at least in Egypt. But they do have divorce records, so there obviously was a legal implication. But there's nothing that seems specifically wedding related.
I'm sure this is a terrifically naive question, but on the issue of the earrings where one is here and one is back in Egypt, and the bracelet that's cut in half, and how is that? Why does that occur? And was there ever a thought of entering into agreements that pieces would be, complete sets would be here for a year and move back and forth?
Well, at the time of the excavation, I think our curators who were doing the excavations were a little more interested in the archaeology aspect of it at that point, so it was more the information that could be gained. And the Sudanese government, I don't know why they did it that way, honestly. But one of the problems today with doing there have been exhibitions. There was a big exhibition that traveled around in Europe in the 90s that we lent over 100 objects to it, and they actually brought the pieces back together for that exhibition. The big problem with trying to do that today is that the United States government forbids us from doing any business with Sudan. We can't even lend these objects overseas without written permission from the Office of Foreign Asset Control, even though we've owned them for 100 years. Nothing is allowed to be imported from Sudan. So we have to go through many hoops even to send these overseas and get them back again. So until the relations between the US and Sudan thaw somewhat, it's unlikely that any of the Sudanese material will ever come to the US. Mm-hmm. Oh, tough call. The Hathor Pendant is, I think, certainly technically the most spectacular piece in the show. And I know Yvonne, who is a jewelry expert in jewelry of all periods and cultures, when asked what she thought was the most important piece of jewelry in the MFA, picked that. But I'm kind of partial to that electrum necklace with the notched wire trim and the applique decoration. In part because I could actually see myself wearing it. The Hathor pendant is a little fussy for my aesthetic. I would like it to have just in my house, but I'm not sure I'd see myself wearing it. And with my cats, I don't think I'd have it in my house either.
Hi, I was just curious, when you showed us the picture of the gentleman with the jewelry on, my first instinct was actually that the arm decoration were tattoos, and I was just wondering if tattooing was also a popular method of sort of adornment during the period, or whether that was just something that wasn't really a part of the culture.
There is evidence of tattooing, certainly in Egypt. Among these royal burials at Merowe, in many cases, the burials were so disturbed that the remains, you wouldn't be able to tell if they'd had tattoos. A lot of them are just like the odd skull and a few bones. The soil in Sudan is very, I think it's acidic. And also they're very prone to insect damage. So a lot of these bodies are in really, really poor states of preservation. Some of the bodies from Kerma are in pretty good shape. And I can't remember whether they have tattoos. I know there's certainly been tattooed bodies found in Egypt. So the concept was known in that part of the world. You think of any? Rita?
Wonderful lecture, Denise. I'm fascinated about the language. And when did they develop a written language? And is there no kind of Rosetta Stone that would allow us to translate
We are
it?
still hoping for it. During the whole Kerma period and earlier, there was no writing. In fact, there's relatively little even figural art. It's mostly, not figure art, but of humans. Most of the artistic representations are animals and boats, and there's no writing. I mean, obviously they had a language, but we don't know what it was. And then when Pianki takes over Egypt, they obviously imported scribes, or at least people who knew, and they, in this effort to sort of bring Egypt back into the fold of Amun-Ra, they did a lot of temple renovations and left texts claiming to have rescued old texts and recopied old texts and saved temple archives. So they were really interested in the Egyptian script, so they start using the Egyptian script, which is only used on sort of official royal monuments and temples. I doubt the population was speaking Egyptian. So, hieroglyphs have been translated, and the Egyptian language has been translated, so that's relatively easy. And then in the Meroitic period, so the Egyptian texts are from the Napatan period, then they gradually phase out. In the late Napatan, we don't have any text again. And then in the Meroitic period, they developed their own alphabetic script. They're not hieroglyphs, they have single letter meaning, so it's an alphabet. The sounds have been figured out. So, for example, we know Queen Amanashiketo was named Amanashiketo because her name can be read. But the grammar hasn't been worked out. The vocabulary hasn't been worked out. And there are a number of scholars. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a scholar here from Italy who was working on one of our Meroitic stele. He was actually studying with one of the people who was at the forefront of trying to translate it. And progress is being made. Offering formula, things that are kind of repetitive, names of places. We can tell in some cases, or I say the royal we, people who read Meroitic, I'm not one of them, can actually begin to make out things like accounts of military actions because of the place names. And so they're getting glimpses of it. But what we really desperately need is a text that is either in Egyptian and Meroitic, or in Meroitic and Latin or Greek, or something that we can, we had a tantalizing object down in storage, actually, that has a little text in Meroitic painted on it. It's a sherd, it's a tiny fragment. And another fragment of text that appears to be Demotic, which is the language of Egypt in the Greco-Roman period. And that's translated, but it was too fragmentary. We tried photoshopping it and doing all manner of everything we could to bring out the signs, and it's just not enough there. So our little Rosetta sherd did not work out.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the soldering process? I can't imagine joining these very intricate and minute pieces of gold together. You have temperature control and...
It's pretty mind-boggling that they could do it, because the solder itself, like for example, the nugget that has the Biel on it, which is about 750 BC, the gold was analyzed, and the gold itself is almost pure gold, the Biel is almost pure gold, and the solder is a little bit higher silver content, which seems funny to me because that would be harder to melt than the gold. But in some cases, there's a different solder that's actually, and in the case of the granulation, if I'm doing now, you'll have to look at the appendix in the book because the conservators are better equipped to answer this than I am about the technical aspects. But the gold is heated just to the point where the little balls melt enough to stick to the gold, so they wouldn't have to add a third, like a little piece of solder in between, because they're microscopically tiny in some cases. But it would have been. I mean, I don't know how anybody without a blowtorch or some controlled heat source could ever make any of this jewelry. It's really, and you think about it too, the wires, that they had to actually roll the wire or stretch the wire. They hadn't even had the technique of pulling it through holes. So they were just, I mean, if you think about how frustrating they must have been when they made this really fine wire and then went to braid it and it broke. I mean, and it must have happened. But the fact that they could do all these things with basically fires that were made of wood and open to the elements is pretty amazing. There's representations in Egyptian art that show jewelers actually at work. And they usually have one person with, who's actually tending to the coals or the wood, and then somebody else with a bellows or some kind of a blowing instrument that keeps the air kind of supply standardized. But I'm often amazed to think that they actually managed to do this.
I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. So I guess I'll start with the one that's most important to me. And that is, I understand that the MFA, other than the Sudan, has the best Nubian collection in the world. And we've got a glimpse of it here. When are we going to see the rest on display? It's also in the school curriculum. It'd be wonderful to have that available for Boston and area school students. So can you tell me what the future looks like?
Well, we hope it's sooner than we find that Rosetta Stone. Basically what's happened is that there's a bit of a logjam on galleries. The space where it's going to go, we have a wonderful plan where it will be almost 3 times the size of the old Nubian gallery, which will be wonderful. But unfortunately, there's a Greek gallery there now, and people's offices are there now. So basically we need to have a Greek gallery. We need a new Greek daily life gallery to get the Greek material out of the way so we can put the Nubian material there. So, I mean, we have a new director coming soon, so we don't know what the priorities will be. They may change, but that's the goal, is to get a Greek daily life gallery done, and that will free up space for at least part of the Nubian collection. The jewelry will be on view for another couple of years. And we still have, there's scattered Nubian material. The statue of St. Kameniskin that's currently in the jewelry show will continue to be on view in the meantime. And obviously we have the big colossal pieces upstairs, but we are hoping it's soon. But we need to get those pesky Greeks out of the way first. He's trying.
I also have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to make it into one question. It seems to me that because they were so excellent in creating this gold, they were excellent because they got a lot of practice. Mm-hmm. They were making a lot of gold. And that led to my wondering, where is all the stuff? Where is the rest of it? If they were in a place where they were trading, and Merrill, for example, was a highly cosmopolitan place, wouldn't it be here, there, and elsewhere? And who else has it, as far as you can tell? Is there another place that has a center where it's been collected, or is it scattered everywhere?
Sadly, most of it's melted down. Most ancient jewelry has been melted down and made into something else. Even in antiquity, we have accounts of grave robbers distributing. It's almost like a cottage redistribution industry, where grave robbery was really helped to kind of almost keep the economy going at times. So, I mean, much of the jewelry that you see today is probably made out of melted down ancient gold that's just been recycled. One hopes, there's still a ton of excavations going on in Sudan now. There's probably 40 or 50 sites being excavated now. So the possibility is always there that another cache of this will be found somewhere. But the grave robbers were very, very determined, and as I said, most of these things were completely robbed. But in terms of museum collections, there's Nubian jewelry. The University of Pennsylvania has they excavated in Nubia as well. The Oriental Institute of Chicago has a good collection of Nubian material. The Oh, the Munich and Berlin have the fabulous Ferlini treasure, that was actually one of the only intact royal burials ever found. And so they've got hundreds of pieces of beautiful Meroitic jewelry. And there's some in the British Museum, but there's not a lot of places to go see it. Which is why both the exhibition and the book were something that we were so excited about doing, because we can and not have to borrow anything from anybody or.
Hi, Denise. You just touched on the current exhibitions, or I mean the current excavations. Who's doing that? Like, who else is there now and who's excavating? Are they Sudanese, and how are...
They're usually
what's
a
going on?
joint team, a joint team of Sudanese people working with foreign projects, and there are even American projects. We have, on the site of Jebel Barkal, we have colleagues from Boston who are working there. And in recent years, the government of Qatar has set up a fund to help support archaeological excavations, conservation, and developing tourism for Sudan. And they have given millions and millions and millions of, 40 of these expeditions I mentioned are being funded by the Qatari government. And they're also funding new museums and conservation and wayfinding and walkways and things. But the sites are not at all well visited, even now, and they're subject to vandalism and so forth because they're not well protected. But no, you name a country. When Rita and I went to a conference last fall in Switzerland, and there were people from, name a country, they had someone there. There's people from all over the world working there. So it's funny that Nubia is so poorly known in the US in particular. People in Europe or in Japan, they have TV specials about it. And like they put together these huge traveling exhibitions, and people in the US don't know about it. And it's a vicious cycle, because when you try to do an exhibition or a book about Nubia, invariably someone will say, but who's going to read it, or who's going to come? No one's ever heard of Nubia. So it's like, so because no one's ever heard of it, you don't do the exhibition, so then no one's ever heard of it, and it feeds into itself. So hopefully, as there's a lot more work going on now, and there have been a couple National Geographic specials, and exciting finds may come out from some of these projects, it will become better now. It doesn't help the fact that we don't have good relations with the government of Sudan. So it's not a place where Americans are likely to go on vacation. But apparently there's a lot better infrastructure. It's a lot less rustic than it used to be. And we'll see, actually, the Tim Kendall, who's actually based in Salem, Massachusetts, and has an expedition in Nubia, was just excavating at Jebel Barkal and found a decorated Meroitic temple that had just been buried underground. So there's definitely a lot there still to be found, even more so than Egypt. Egypt as well, but because there still are lots of places that are still to be excavated. And we have the colossal Nubian statues upstairs in our gallery, and they were found at Jebel Barkal in a cache where they had been buried after the temple had been destroyed. And maybe 10 years ago, a French and Swiss team working at Kerma found Napatan temples and another cache of almost identical statues, a huge cache. So, for example, we excavated at Kerma, but we missed the entire Napatan occupation of Kerma. So there's still major things to be found.
With so many of these objects made of gold, metals, and rock, how do you date them? Is it contextual? And in the same respect with functionality, whether you determine something was a necklace or a belt, how do you even begin to go about that?
This is where the archaeological records are so important, because Reisner was really at the forefront of using photography in his excavations, and he took thousands of glass plate negatives. I can't imagine how they carried these big boxes of glass negative plates out and exposed them in the field and successfully brought them home mostly in one piece. But when you have an excavation photo, you can see exactly how the beads were found. So you can see the body with the beads where they were found. And they recorded them pretty carefully in their object registers as well. So a lot of it is where on the body they were found. And then in the case of those hair ornaments that were found near the head, the people thought they were earrings, so there are still mistakes to be made. In terms of dating, if there's text, if there's writing, we're great, because then the king has a name and you know roughly when that king lived. What Reisner did with the royal cemeteries was try to use the relations between names, but then he kind of randomly decided how long a generation was, and figured each king was a generation. And then based on stylistic similarities or inscriptions that were found in the non-royal tombs, he lumped those into the same generations. And so it gave a kind of a rough framework for, and if you have pottery, the pottery style will be a big indication. But Reisner's method has been refined a bit since then, but it's held up pretty well. So it has a combination of inscriptions, stylistic changes, or pottery and other finds that have fixed. If someone came in now and handed us a string of those stratified eye beads, we would say they're Meroitic, no question, because we know a tomb where similar beads were found that has a good solid date. And the more recent it gets, the easier it gets, because then you start to get overlap with Greek and Roman inscriptions, which is where, when you're done with these very early A group and C group, which are called A group and C group because no one knows what else to call them, that we have no written records and not a lot of material discussing them elsewhere either. So it's sort of a combination of things, but the archaeological context is huge, which is why it's such a pity when so many sites have been disturbed, objects have been looted, because without that context, you may not know.
Well, thank you, Denise, for presenting today. Thank you all for coming. Buy the book, and we'll see Denise in Taste